Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting basically the light side of Star Wars Shatterpoint, the starter set. Now this is going to be a different paint guide to what you're used to if you subscribe to my channels, as I've already painted these and someone requested that I sort of give a guide even though they're already painted, and I didn't really fancy shelling out 120 odd quid for another set. As I have neither the time nor the funds really to repaint these stuff. So I'm just going to talk you through how I painted them step by step and without actually showing you any demonstrations though. To make things easier, I sprayed Ahsoka and the Clone Troopers with some white spray, a matte white spray I should be more specific, from Colourforge, and the rest I sprayed with some matte black spray. So starting with how I painted the white, obviously I'm using a white undercoat, but to kick things off it's actually easier to get all of the black details out of the way first. So any black details were first painted with some Abaddon black. This was then washed with some Nuln Oil just to make sure that we got all the black sections, or make them as deep as we could. And then they were highlighted with some Corvus Black, followed by a 50-50 mix of Corvus Black and Eshin Grey. After the black was out of the way, I then moved on to the white. However, I didn't paint the white of the exhausts from the jetpacks just yet. That was one of the last things I actually did. But as I already had a white base coat, this made things a lot easier. So all I did was I used a little bit of Basilicanum Grey mixed with some contrast medium and painted all the white areas. Now, after that had dried, I basically just used nothing else apart from some matte white. Normally I would do a little bit of a mix, but I didn't really need it. I just felt like it was going to use a couple of very thin layers. So all I did was add a little bit of white to my palette and then watered it down until it was sufficiently thin enough to stay on the actual model, but it would need more than one coat. Basically, the trick is just patience. Basically, make sure that each coat has dried and then gradually build up the layers. And if you want a little bit more shading, just do what you normally would do and don't paint too far into the recesses. While I was waiting for washes and things to dry on the white, I would have moved on and went ahead and started painting the Mandalorians and working on their flight suits or undersuits. I'm not entirely sure what they're called, to be honest, but basically the sections in between the armor. So to paint the flight suit for the male Mandalorian, I would have used a bit of the Fang. This would have then been followed by a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade, as I want to keep that blue, or as much blue as possible. Once that wash had dried, I relayered the Fang, making sure I avoided any of the recesses. And this would have been followed by a 50-50 mix of the Fang and Rust Grey. And then lastly, Rust Grey for the final highlight. Next, we'd have moved on to the female Mandalorian. However, we're going to follow the steps of painting black normally because she's got quite a dark undersuit, but we'd have just given it one more extra step of a highlight of Eshin Grey. For Bo-Katan, we'd have started with some Eshin Grey, followed by a wash of Nuln Oil, then a 50-50 mix of Eshin Grey and Mechanica Standard Grey, and then finally Mechanica Standard Grey all by itself. After that, I painted all of the metal areas. Now that's pretty much just on the Mandalorians and Ahsoka. There's a tiny little bit on Anakin Skywalker, but it's just really this lightsaber and a little bit of sort of clasps and things on his outfit. So I started with a base coat of Iron Hand Steel. This was then followed by a wash of Nuln Oil. Once that had dried, I then relayered the Iron Hand Steel, taking care to avoid any of the recesses. This was then followed by a 50-50 mix of Iron Hand Steel and Stormhost Silver. And then finally, Stormhost Silver just by itself. Next up, I painted the blue. Now, the blue is the standout colour on pretty much every single one of these miniatures except Anakin. I painted all of the blue exactly the same, so there's not going to be any deviation, and I did it all in one go to make sure that basically everything was as uniform as it could possibly be. So I started with a base coat of Thousand Suns Blue. This was then followed by a wash to all the blue areas with some Arkellian Green. Now I know it says green, but it is still quite a bluish colour. Once that wash has dried, I then relayered the Thousand Suns Blue. This is then followed by a 50-50 mix of Thousand Suns Blue and Ahriman Blue. And that was then followed by an edge highlight of Ahriman Blue just by itself. Then to finish off all the blue, and for Ahsoka, I used some Cantor Blue on her head, followed by a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade, and then lastly a 50-50 mix of Cantor Blue and Matte White for the highlight. Finally, starting on Anakin, as we hadn't really started him yet, I first started on his boots. That was just simply Xandri Dust, followed by a wash of Agrax Earthshade. This was followed by a relayer of Xandri Dust, and then a 50-50 mix of Xandri Dust and Talon Sand. Moving on to his robes, the inside part of the robes were painted with some Catachat Flesh, which was washed with some Agrax Earthshade, and then simply relayered. Then for the outside of those robes, that was painted with some Dryad Bark. This was once again washed with some Agrax Earthshade, followed by a relayer of Dryad Bark, and then a 50-50 mix of Dryad Bark and Gothel Brand for an edge highlight. Finally, for his trousers and his belt, along with the belt of some of the Mandalorians, that was painted with some Mournfang Brown. That was then washed with some Agrax Earthshade, followed by a relayer of Mournfang Brown, then a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown, and then finally Scrag Brown just by itself. For the little yellow lights on the Mandalorians, they were simply painted with some Avalanche Sunset, followed by a quick highlight of a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Dawn Yellow. Moving on to the exhausts for both Bo-Katan and the other Mandalorian, they started with a coat of Dawnstone at the bottom. This was followed by Grey Seer, then a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and Matte White, and then finally Matte White all by itself. For the actual flames, we started with some Avalanche Sunset, followed by a wash of Cassandori Yellow, then a 50-50 mix of Avalanche Sunset and Dawn Yellow. Moving on to the skin of Ahsoka, I started with a base coat of Rat Skin Flesh, followed by a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade, then a relayer of Rat Skin Flesh, and a 50-50 mix of Rat Skin Flesh and Tau Light Ochre. Then moving on to Bo-Katan and Anakin's skin, that was first painted with some Bugman's Glow, followed by a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade, then a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone, then Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself, then a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh, and then a final highlight of Kislev Flesh. The eyes were painted with a little bit of Abaddon Black first, then some Matte White, and then finally Abaddon Black for the pupil. Anakin's hair was painted with some Dryad Bark, and that was simply just followed with a wash of Agrax Earthshade. For Bo-Katan, her hair was painted with some Jakara Orange, followed by a wash of Fugan Orange, and then relayered with a 50-50 mix of Jakara Orange and Fire Dragon Bright. The lightsabers were painted the same as I painted the blue, just with a little extra white added at the end. And the bases, the grey areas were painted with Dawnstone, highlighted with some Grey Seer. And muddy areas were painted with some XV88, followed by a highlight of Tau Light Ochre. And then finally, after tidying up the rims with some Abaddon Black, they were washed with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. And there we are, that's how I painted these guys from the light side part of the Star Wars Shatterpoint starter set. They were a lot of fun to paint, and I absolutely had a huge blast getting them all done over the time. They didn't take too long whatsoever. In fact, they only took round about sort of 10 hours to paint for all 8. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I really do hope it helped. If it did, give the channel a subscribe, the video a like, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you again so much for watching, and goodbye for now.